If we were arrested today after walking out of those doors after Mass for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict us? Let me say that again. If we were arrested today after walking out of those doors after Mass for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence for the DA's office to get a conviction on us? There's a beautiful story that comes to us from the Amish community where a group of evangelical Christians were going door to door, engaging the Amish people in conversation about Christianity. An Amish farmer was asked by the group if he was a Christian. And the farmer paused and asked the group if they had a pad and a pencil to write with. He proceeded to write down 8 names and gave the pad back to the group of men with this beautiful reply. I have given you 8 names of people who can tell you if I'm a Christian or not. If you were asked that same question this morning, who would be on your list? Who would be on your list? In today's gospel, the Pharisees are grumbling about the kind of people who were coming to hear Jesus. Those gathered around the Master were uneducated people who had little use for pompous show in religious matters. The Sadducees and Pharisees held them in contempt. They regarded Jesus' followers as the scum of the earth, fishermen, tax collectors, and prostitutes. And particularly, it galled the Pharisees when Jesus said that these folks of low social stature would get into the kingdom of heaven before they would as religious elite. This was a bizarre teaching for many of Jesus' listeners. Yet Jesus makes it clear that this is at the heart of today's gospel. The last paragraph to today's gospel is worth repeating. When you hold a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you. When Jesus stood up to preach his first sermon in his hometown synagogue, he announced his mission. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. What is Jesus saying to us in this teaching? First of all, he's saying this, and this is really important. He's saying that the church is the one institution in our society that does not exist for the benefit of its own members. It does not exist for the benefit of its own members. Yes, it's natural for us to want to be around people who are like us. But Christ wants us to do something that is very unnatural. To reach out to those who may not be like us, but who need us. And part of that reaching out is having the courage to move out of our comfort zones in our everyday lives. There's a simple but nevertheless inspiring story that comes to us from New York City in the latter part of the 19th century, where segregation had its ugly grip on American culture. An African-American man had just arrived by train and was walking along 42nd Street carrying 2 large, heavy suitcases. Suddenly, a hand took a hold of one of the suitcases, and a pleasant voice said, "Pretty heavy, brother? Suppose you let me take one. I'm going your way." The African-American man resisted, but finally allowed the young white man to assist him in carrying his burden, which at the time was a shocking display of human solidarity. And for several blocks, they walked along chatting like they had known each other for years. And that, said Booker T. Washington, was the first time that I'd ever met Theodore Roosevelt. What a beautiful example, brothers and sisters, of the significance of one man carrying another man's burden. You see, and this is what's important about this story. Teddy Roosevelt, who went on to become the 26th President of the United States, was not too good. He was not too wrapped up in himself to help someone in need, regardless of the color of their skin. Larry Sarver from Palm City, Florida, who now works in youth and adult ministry, gives us some very interesting insight in today's gospel from his many years as a police officer. He notes that as a police officer, he was required to respond to several traffic accidents during his career, some of them which had very severe injuries. He noticed at the scene of those accidents, there were three groups of people, each with a different response toward those involved in the accident. The first group are the bystanders and the onlookers. They were curious and watched to see what would happen, but had very little active involvement. The second group are the police officers, of whom he was one. The response of the police is to investigate the cause of the accident, assign blame, and give out appropriate warnings and punishments. And the third group are the paramedics. They are the people who are usually the most welcome by those involved in the accident. The paramedics could care less about whose fault it was, and they did not engage in lecturing about bad driving habits. Their response was to help those who were hurt. They bandaged wounds, freed trapped people, and gave words of encouragement. Three groups, notes Larry Sarver. One is uninvolved, one is assigning blame and assessing punishment, and one is bandaging wounds, freeing trapped people, and giving words of encouragement. Many people in every society like to be mere spectators. Their mantra, their MO, is, I don't want to get involved. And I call those people grandstanders, for they are content to sit in the stands and comment on how bad things are, but choose not to get their hands dirty in the arena of life. One of the most tragic stories in American history of being an apathetic grandstander happened in the late 1920s. This is a true story, where a man drowned in the cold waters of Massachusetts Bay. He had been walking along a pier when he tripped and fell into the water. And as he bobbed in the waves, he screamed for help. His friends heard his desperate cries off in the distance, and they ran as fast as they could to assist him. Unfortunately, they arrived too late to save their friend. Upon investigation, they discovered that only a few yards away on the beach was a sunbather who had heard their friends call for help. When they asked, "Why didn't you go after him? Can't you swim?" The man responded, "Yes, I can swim quite well. I just didn't want to get involved." Sadly, in the legal case that ensued, the court concluded that the sunbather had no legal responsibility to save the man from drowning. Yet we know as believers we would have a moral one. The scribes and Pharisees whom Jesus confronted saw themselves as the police, assigning blame, assessing punishment. They were quick to criticize those who violated the law of Moses and dealt out punishment where they felt justified. They even tried to police Jesus. Notice how our gospel passage today from Luke begins. On a Sabbath, Jesus went out to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were watching him carefully. He was being watched so that they could catch him doing something wrong. And when Jesus refused to conform to the religious leaders' understanding of what was lawful, it was they who assigned him the cruel punishment of the cross. They love being the police. Such behavior is not confined to the synagogue. It can happen often and does in our own personal lives in the church. David Kinnaman of the Barna Research Group reports that unchurched people often have the perception that if they go to church for help, they will be judged rather than helped. And author Dan Kimball, in his book titled "They Like Jesus, but Not the Church," focuses on the perception of today's culture by many young people that church people have the tendency to be judgmental. This critical spirit becomes a turnoff in any attempt to reach people with the gospel message of redemption. In Larry Sarver's metaphor of spectators, police, and paramedics, the scribes and Pharisees saw themselves as police, enforcers of the law. And here's a great question that we can reflect on. How do we see ourselves today as we reflect on today's gospel? Are we a spectator? Are we the police? Or are we the paramedics? Which one are we? It would be great for all of us this week to reflect on these questions and do some real soul searching about how God would have us respond to today's gospel passage. It's pretty clear that the Lord wants all of us to identify not with the spectators, not with the police, but rather with the paramedics, bandaging wounds, freeing trapped people, and giving words of encouragement. Jesus is very clear on this point. The church is the one institution in our society that does not exist for the benefit of its own members. We are to be God's hands and feet reaching out to those who are in need. Well, why don't we see this type of reaching out more in our society? I will answer that in 5 simple words. Reaching out is not easy. It's much easier to be a spectator and sit in the stands and pass judgment on others than it is to get our hands dirty, seeking to minister to the needs of others. But that's not what Jesus wants from us. He wants us to reach out to those who cannot pay us back. For a number of years in college and afterwards, I competed in the sport of weightlifting. And for many of those years, I trained with a close friend who struggled with the gay lifestyle. Just as many people struggle with alcoholism or pornography or any other number of issues. We had several conversations regarding his efforts to be freed from this bondage. We often had him over for dinner. Our conversations were not always easy, and my wife and I, Janet, had to fight against our own tendency to be a policeman. But over time, we learned to set judgment aside and love him while not condoning the lifestyle. Recently, my wife, Janet, ran into this friend, and he told her a beautiful story. He told her that he had become Catholic because it was the one place where he felt he was at home. In his former church, he experienced condemnation. He told us that he found respect, understanding, and encouragement within the Catholic Church. Over the past several years, our ministry team has been teaching catechism at the county jail. And over 130 men and women have been received into the church as a result of this outreach. They didn't come because a policeman accused them or a jury condemned them. They responded instead to a loving invitation. They saw dozens of volunteers give up their Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays to spend time with them. And yesterday, we had another one come into the church in a beautiful celebration. This ministry isn't easy. Most of the men and women behind bars have a long history of bad decisions and bad relationships. They are the outcasts of our society. But they are hungry to hear that God has a plan and a purpose for their lives, just as He has for each one of us. How do we see ourselves today? There is probably some spectator and policeman in all of us. The Lord is asking us to begin to intentionally shift towards being the paramedic, freeing trapped people, caring for the injured, getting our hands dirty. And sometimes that intentional shift may lead us to make the ultimate sacrifice of our lives, as was the case of Tom Burnett. Tom was a passenger on United Flight 93 on September the 11th, 2001. He called his wife from the hijacked plane, having realized by then that 2 other planes had crashed into the World Trade Center. "Honey, it doesn't look like we're going to make it," he said to his wife. But many of us are going to do something about it by taking over the plane, as they knew they had heard it was going to go to the White House. And because these people did, many lives were saved. Our gospel today clearly directs us to reach out to those who cannot repay us. And if we do, many lives will spend eternity with our Heavenly Father. Brothers and sisters, let's all go out and do something about announcing the gospel of the Lord to a culture that so desperately needs it. Amen.